Right, Mavis, welcome to episode 4 of These Little Victories with myself, Jay Fender. Today's guest is a remarkable man, Tim Slessor, a 91-year-old documentarian who started his career with the BBC in 1955. In the podcast we discuss many things, from him going to school in Australia as a young boy in the 40s with Rupert Murdoch. We also discuss David Attenborough commissioning his first TV documentary in 1955 and how he worked alongside him at the BBC. And we also discuss his military service in the Navy. We cover many subjects, so it's a really interesting listen and I think you're really going to enjoy it. Now, if you're enjoying the content we're putting out on this podcast, please just hit us a subscribe on YouTube or whatever platform you're streaming on. And if you want to support us further, you can pick up merch at spiritofspikeisland.com. But for now, let's get into the podcast and I hope you enjoy it.
It is quite interesting, the number of people. I don't say it happens constantly, but every now and again, someone sort of says, read your book, and you say, well, not exactly who are you, but
yeah,
out of the blue.
That's quite nice, though.
Oh yes,
that people have found your literary work and want to come up and express their admiration for it. How long did that book take you to write?
Oh,
your first book, that is.
Oh, about 6 months.
Right. And that was written.
That was written 1950. 56 into 57, because I think it was published toward autumn 57.
Right. Who published that book?
An outfit called Harrops.
Right.
And the one that took me the longest was not an expedition at all. It's taking the Ministry of Defence apart.
Right.
Because that had to be very well researched.
Of course.
Because I was really... The name of the book is Lying in State.
Right.
Because I'm accusing them of... they would...
Subterfuge.
They wouldn't even admit to covering up. That's what it is. They make cock-ups and then they cover up. Because my father was lost in the largest single loss of Royal Navy life in World War II in a carrier, which is still the subject of bullshit from what would have been the Admiralty.
And that was was that the HMS Glorious?
Yes.
Right. Yeah. And I believe, was that 1940?
June 1940, very early in, First World War hadn't been going a year.
Second World War, sorry.
Yeah,
no, that's right. Yeah. That where did that go down? That ship
went down, coming back from northern Norway to the UK. So it was up in the Arctic.
Wow,
with 2 destroyers. Well, no, it shouldn't. It should have just stayed 24 hours and come back with the main group.
Right.
That's where the basis of the controversy is.
Right.
Because it was doing what a nutty idiot captain required it to do, and of course there wasn't anybody senior to him in the ship who could say no.
Right. So he decided to make their own route.
He was a submarine hero from World War One,
right?
And quite unsuited, therefore, to command a carrier, because the two is quite different.
Of course,
carrier is dependent on working with a task force. Submarine is dependent on solo.
Yeah. And did
We're
you...
not recording this, are we?
Yeah.
Oh, we are?
Yeah, if that's all right. It's... how much information were you given about the demise of the HMS Glorious as your father lost his life on it from the military? And, did you...
Well, of course, in June 1940, one wasn't told very much. The civilians, well, even in the services, you didn't learn very much. You were told what the Admiralty, in that case, wanted you to know.
Yeah.
So one wasn't in a position to debate it until 1946
Right.
or 1945 when the war had finished. And it's then when because one of the questions being asked right from the very beginning was why was that ship coming back with only 2 destroyers when by staying 24 hours off Narvik, northern Norway, she could have come back with Ark Royal and 8 destroyers and 2 cruisers.
Right.
Powerful little force.
Yeah, of course.
Instead of that, the captain of Glorious detached her and was coming back by himself with no flying reconnaissance out ahead, with a third of his boilers shut down to save fuel, etc., etc. I mean, the thing was a cock-up.
Yeah, and so the HMS Glorious set off before the fleet.
Yes, 24 hours. Just sort of wait and see the people who approve of the official story say, she was short of fuel. No, she wasn't short of fuel. We know how much fuel she had because she was travelling in company with Ark Royal. And we know that both of them had refuelled in Scapa Flow, at the far north of Scotland, on their last trip, and they had enough fuel. Well, if Ark Royal had enough fuel, Glorious certainly did.
Yeah.
Anyway.
No, and what happened to the other 2 ships? Were they?
They were, all 3 were sunk within 60 minutes.
Oh my gosh! So German U-boats.
No, by Gneisenau, as 2 German battleships, Gneisenau and Scharnhorst. And there's quite a story in that. But anyway, let's get back to...
No, I think that's an interesting story. I'm happy to talk. We've got plenty of time to explore those bits. If you seem to be, you seem to know a lot about it. Have you found that...
Well, I spent 2 years researching it, and I've got various people very supportive. I mean, in some senses, the support I most value is that of the official naval historian who wrote the official history of the Royal Navy in World War II. And initially, he accepted the official story, but I talked to him and showed him the evidence which led in a different direction. And then he started his own research, and he spent a year, not very much contact with me, because he wanted to sort of be clean.
And independent of bias.
And he totally supportive. He says,
what was his name, the historian, do you remember?
Kingsley. I should have done my homework. I'm old, and my memory for names...
That's... All right, how old are you at the moment?
91.
Right, well, that can be forgotten. I can't remember people's names when I met them 2 minutes ago, so we can...
I get postcards from sort of, Jack and Jill, and I know exactly who they are, but I can't remember their surnames. I can't look at my address book. Well, I can, but it'll take 10, 20 minutes looking from A to Z through an address book with probably, 1,000 or more names in it.
So with the situation with losing your father at sea, you then went into the Navy to do your military service.
Much.
And
my father was lost in 1940, and my mother, who was Australian-born and comes from a long-standing Australian family.
In what part of Australia?
Where was she born?
Yeah, where was her family? In Sydney or?
My umpteen times great-grandfather was in the First Fleet, 1788, a naval lieutenant, and was almost immediately dispatched from mainland Sydney,
right?
What is now Sydney was in those days just nothing.
Yeah.
To take Norfolk Island. Norfolk Island is a small island about 500 or 600 miles east of Brisbane.
Okay.
And had, according to Cook, Captain Cook, who'd been there 8 years before, marvellous pine trees for masts, remembering that at that time we couldn't get pine masts from North America because they'd kicked us out.
Right.
and flax for sales. So he was sent to take Norfolk Island with 24 convicts and about eight Marines. And he subsequently became the third governor of New South Wales, which was Australia. So my mother used to say if we went back any further, we'd be Aborigine.
Yeah.
Which we would.
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry, I forget your...
No. So your mother was raised in...
Well, no, my mother, strangely, was born in a small mining town in Western Australia called Kalgoorlie. And she was the marriage of her mother and my grandfather.
Yeah.
My granny wasn't a great success. He was a mining engineer, and so my granny went back to Melbourne, where she had been born. She was born in 1880, and was looking for some way of earning a living. She had a very good singing voice. Now, at that time, the most famous Australian on this side was a woman called Dame Nellie Melba.
Okay.
And Melba from Melbourne.
Oh, okay.
See? And so my granny came to Europe with my mother, and they never went back.
Right.
So, but my granny did go back. So when my father was killed, my mother and I went to Australia. So I spent most of the war in Australia.
What part? And what were you in Western Australia?
Mostly in Melbourne. No.
Oh, Melbourne.
Yeah, mostly in Melbourne. Well, I was at school in a town just south of Melbourne, and I spent all my holidays on a sheep and cattle station, about 150 miles north of Melbourne, and got to know a young man, same age as me, same school, same house, called Rupert Murdoch.
You're joking?
No, I'm not joking. And his mother actually was obviously somewhat embarrassed that he could be going to this very good school in Australia, Geelong Grammar. And this small boy of the same age from England, an evacuee, couldn't afford it. And she didn't pay the whole caboodle, but she arranged it. So I went to school with Murdoch, largely paid for by Mrs. Murdoch.
Wow.
Yes.
That's what was he like as a kid?
Well, he was a nice chap. He wasn't very clever. I'm always slightly surprised that he's done so marvelously. But he obviously a very good business brain.
Of course.
Yes.
So he was from money originally. So his family he was from money. His family were quite wealthy.
Oh well, yes. His father, Sir Keith Murdoch. And I remember he came down to the school and he took Rupert, me, and Rupert's three cousins with whom I was always spending the holiday. They were the people who came from the sheep and cattle station. And that was the first Rolls Royce I ever saw.
Wow. What that would have been in the 40s?
1940.
Yeah.
40, 41, 40. I was at this school. If you tell Australians today I went to Geelong Grammar, they sort of, it's rather like saying I went to Eton.
Oh, okay.
We don't need you.
Right.
Push off.
Yeah.
But I was there from 1940 to 1945, because the moment the war was over, my mother wanted me to get back.
Come back to the UK.
So I was sent back in a carrier. I looked after by a small detachment of Royal... I mean, when I say looked after by a small detachment of Royal Marines, they had proper duties, but amongst other things, keep an eye on that lad.
So would you have been about 14 at that point when you came back?
Yeah, I think I was about 13 or 14. 1945, I'd have been 13 or 14 years.
Right.
So
and did your mum not come back with you at that point?
Yes, my mother.
So you came back together?
No, she came back in a normal ship. But she wanted me to get back as quickly as possible. And we had relatives in England who would look after me before she got back. So then I went to school here.
And where did you go to school when you got back to
I
London?
went to school called at Malvern in Worcestershire.
Oh, okay.
Yes. And then, you see, when I came to do my national service, I went for the Royal Marines because I knew a bit about them. I'd been looked after by them.
Okay. Yeah. So the fact that your father had perished and there had been a subsequent cover-up didn't deter you?
But that didn't. I didn't become aware of that till many years later.
Okay.
Many years later.
Right.
There were certain aspects on the official story which just somehow worried me, didn't really ring true. And so I started some research, and one thing led to another, led to another, led to another. And I spent 2 years researching that and talking to people, and making long-distance calls to people all over the world.
Right.
About this and that and the other. And, yes, that was all quite a bit later.
Right.
Because I think that book, Lying in State, I'm trying to think when it was published. I should have done my homework.
That's all right.
But it was published about 20 years ago.
Okay.
It was published in 1982. It was published coincident with our quite separate, our intrusion into Iraq and Iran.
So the early 90s, 1992. Because from what I've read, you retired from the BBC in 1990, and then you went on to release Lying in State. So,
right. What do you know more about it?
Well, dates, they can all get jumbled up, but I think it was in the 90s when that was first published. But going back to, we'll come back to that in a little while. But did you ever have anything? Did you ever, see Rupert Murdoch after spending time?
I don't think I ever did. Well, he used to come up and stay with his cousins, the three brothers, on the sheep and cattle station.
Okay.
Two were older than me and one was younger, and their mother was Rupert Murdoch. It was Elizabeth Murdoch's sister.
Okay.
In other words, Rupert was their nephew.
Right. Right. And once you came back to England, you didn't ever see him again. He was.
I think the last time I ever saw him was at his aunt's, because there was a third sister who married a naval officer, which is how to come the whole thing connected.
Yeah.
In Chelsea, the last time I saw him, we were both. I think he was at Oxford.
Okay.
And I was at Cambridge. I think he quit on Oxford, Morris, when his father died, so that he could get back to Australia and start running the business.
Okay, so his family business was always to do with newspapers, News Corps.
His father was a journalist. Yes.
Okay, and then he kind of picked up the mantle and ended up buying setting up other papers and taking. Yeah. Yes. Wow.
Yes.
He's a powerful man.
Yes, you could say that.
Yeah. So you joined the Navy to do your service as a Marine. I did. Yes. Yes, and you were posted in Malaya. Is that correct? Yes. I went into the Marines, and then I was sort of part of the Marines that in a sense really mattered was the Commando Brigade. Right. And I thought, well, I was too light and I wasn't powerful enough. I had good stamina, and so I had to go at it. And nobody was more surprised than I was. Right. When I was accepted. Okay. And then I thought I'd have a go for a commission. So I became a lieutenant. It was extraordinary. And then I was sent to Malaya. Well, I was going to Korea, but they changed their mind. Right. And so how long did it take you once you joined the Navy and your service? How long was it before they promoted you to that rank? Well, I think it was about you were training for a year, and then you could. Your basic training is that? Yes. Our training, the Marine training, was twice as long as the Army training. So it's not that basic. Okay. No, it wasn't that basic. And then I forget whether I went to somebody and said, I'd like to have a go to get a commission, or someone said to me, I think you ought to. But in any case, because a long time ago, I forget the details, I did 5 months, I think, with the Army, a place called Eaton Hall up in Cheshire. Okay. Which is where they trained their privates to become officers. Okay. And
So it was based because the Marines didn't have big enough sort of backup to train one or two. There were only one or two ever commissioned. I think in 12 years there were about 6 National Service lieutenants.
Okay.
And then it was sent to Malaya, which was, I mean, that was full-blown active service. And
was it a shock to the system when you got out there? Because obviously
you knew what was coming.
Okay.
Well, I suppose difficult. I suppose it was sort of everything was new, and you had.
I guess the only benefit of you coming from Australia and experiencing the heat in Australia in the summers, the humidity over there, do you think that prepared you for being in that kind of climate?
No, because that part of Australia down in Victoria and Melbourne, yes, it could get hot, but it's not upset. It's not abnormally so. Perhaps if you were up in the Northern Territory or Queensland, it might.
Right.
But it was quite useful. I mean, many years later, when I realised that Australia was coming up to its sort of 200th birthday, I was able to go to the boss and say, look, we ought to do something. And that was, in those days, the BBC was much, well, had more money, and he just said, right, go. So within a week or 2 weeks, I was in Australia setting the thing up. I don't think that has happened today.
No. So that's quite so we'll jump over to that. So you, you finished university at Cambridge. You'd done your active service. You went to university
from school.
Okay.
And after that, I went to Cambridge.
And you did a 3-year degree in geography?
Yes, which was enough to keep you occupied, but not enough to get in the way.
Right. And then, as a consequence of that, we
went on that expedition where we set off to see if we could, and we were lucky because the weather was particularly favourable that year. They didn't get very heavy monsoon rains, which would have made life difficult crossing a lot of rivers in northern Burma where there are no bridges.
Just for anybody who's watching,
yes.
Who might not know your backstory, so Tim went on a 6-man expedition using 2 Land Rovers,
right,
to travel from Europe to Singapore.
Entirely by land.
There
was one 10-minute saltwater crossing where there was no bridge or no way of getting, which was the Bosphorus, Istanbul, where you went from European Turkey 10 minutes to Asiatic Turkey. There is now a bridge.
Okay.
There has been a bridge for about 30, 40 years. But in our day, that was the one sea crossing, if you like, saltwater crossing.
And did you have any funding for that? Was that part of the BBC documentary team at that point?
Partly we were commissioned by the young producer in the BBC called Attenborough.
David Attenborough?
Yes.
Commissioned that?
Yes. And he gave us enough money. I think he gave us £300, or caused the BBC to give us £300, with which we could buy a film camera.
Yes.
And he gave us sort of, not as a gift, but didn't cost enough film to get us to Lebanon, to Beirut.
Okay.
And send back what you shot on the first 7-8 weeks of your journey.
Right.
If I like what I see, I will send you some more film.
And again, we commissioned a film. And a group of undergraduates from Oxford and Cambridge turned up in the office and said they were proposing to drive from London to Singapore. They sounded as though they knew what they were talking about, and I thought we'd take a risk and give them some film.
So he did like what he saw, and he did send us some more film. And so we picked up more film in India, and we had enough film to get. So that resulted in 4, I think, half hours. On
episodes, 4 half-hour episodes.
Yes, on There wasn't it wasn't BBC One because it was just the BBC. There wasn't
Of course.
BBC Two.
There was no distinction because there was only one channel.
Yeah, right,
Yeah.
right. And ITV only started in about, I'm guessing a bit, but about 1956 or 57.
Right. And this was 55.
It wasn't going when we left. I think it was going when we got back.
Right. Okay. And how long was the entire journey from setting off?
Here to there,
Yes.
about 6 months.
And it was 12,000 miles. Is that about right?
Yes, I think actually our mileage on the clock, so to speak, was rather more.
Right.
Because we were making diversions and things. But it would be difficult to do it much more quickly because the governing factor is not so much how many miles you can cover in a day or a week. It's the seasons. So you don't want to leave here in the middle of winter.
Right.
Because by the time you get to Central Europe, the snows may be quite, well, in those days before we had good snow plows and all the rest of it, the winter would set in. Or if you went at some other time, you'd have to wait till you'd get to the Far East coincident with the monsoons. So you'd have to wait. So the governing factor was the climate,
right?
Not the road conditions or lack of that.
Right, and the climate basically dictated how quick your progress was.
Because when we got to India, we sort of marked time in Calcutta for about 4 or 5 weeks till the monsoon had finished.
Right.
And we could then proceed on.
Okay. That's interesting.
So the duration was not so much how our durability or our stamina, it was climatic.
How did you pitch the idea of the series to Attenborough at the BBC? Did you have a relationship with him beforehand?
No.
But did you have somebody who contacted the BBC and you were put on to David, or how did that come about?
I forget the exact details, but remember in those days, we're talking of 1955, Attenborough was not a well-known name.
No, of course not. No.
And
but
I think
do you
we
remember
wrote to somebody in the BBC and said, we've got this possible idea, and we think it would make good. Because one of the crew, one of us, was 3 years older than the rest of us, and had started a camera shop, a photographic business in Cambridge. So he did know a little bit about it. And
he knew what the gentleman who had the camera shop knew a little bit about how to pitch to the BBC, or do you mean knew how to operate the camera?
Sort of a little bit about photography and how you adjusted the camera according to the strength of light. And
of course.
Simple stuff.
Yeah.
I don't know who put us on to Attenborough. I think probably he had some kind of a travelly output, and we probably thought, he's the obvious person to write to.
Right, of course.
So it was...
That's interesting.
Yes, because it's a friendship, which in a sense still... I was trying to think the other day of an excuse to write to him. You can't just write, sort of say hello.
Yeah.
But,
it'd be nice for you to reach out and connect again.
Yes. Well, I will.
I think, it's such an exceptional history, and it's almost the genesis of documentary making on television.
It was early days. You see, it was. I'm trying to think. No, later when I did a series about the American West.
Yeah,
that was the first travel-y sort of thing shown on the new channel, BBC Two, spring of 1964, I think. BBC Two started.
And once you got back from Singapore, one question, did you leave the Land Rovers there?
No. We drove from the French coast to Singapore. When we got to Singapore, we sort of marked time, or recovered, if you like, for 2 or 3 weeks. And then it was not practical to drive back that way. So we shipped from Singapore to Calcutta, which is not, and then we drove back from Calcutta, a rather different route.
Right.
We went through northern Afghanistan and northern Iran, Persia, what was more commonly called Persia.
Yeah.
And we didn't. We tried not to just repeat the route that we'd taken.
Yes, so you see different places.
Different route. And
at any point on the journey there or back, were there any hairy moments where you thought this is a little bit like untoward, or was there anything that stands out?
Somewhere in Thailand, northern Thailand, we managed to turn one of the vehicles over on its side. It skidded and just went over. No, I think we were very lucky. Mind you, although it's a bit conceited to say it, we were quite well organised.
Okay.
Each person, there were 6 of us.
Yeah.
3 per Land Rover.
Yeah.
And there'd be one was the photographer, cameraman.
Yes.
One was a diarist, and sort of second in command, but
yes.
That was me. And then there was someone who looked after the route and the visas and the political permissions.
Almost like a producer, kind of, to make things.
We each had a job, and technically we didn't have a leader. Whatever problem came up, depending on the nature of the problem, was one of us who was particularly sort of that was his thing.
Right, and
we were very well looked after by people on the route, you see, because they were quite intrigued by this bunch of 6 amateurs coming through on one Land Rover painted dark blue for Oxford and the other painted light blue for Cambridge.
That's wonderful.
Well,
it must have been like...
Well, there were 5 of us.
Aliens coming through, they won't see people just driving through, 6 English guys in 2 Land Rovers just driving through their city. It must have been quite unique.
Yeah, because, for example, when we got to northeast India, Assam, which is where a lot of the tea...
Correct, Assam
where
tea.
Our tea comes from.
That's right.
They were very intrigued by... You've driven all the way from England? Goodness. And yes, they were... And they, you must come and stay with us. And so we weren't, we were very warmly welcomed. And
so the hospitality along the route was very nice.
Yes, marvellous.
But in fact, I doubt it would be possible now to do that, because the world has divided itself against itself. And there are plenty of places now where you will not be allowed to cross the frontier. So this journey is both a wonderful journey in the sense that you are discovering the unknown, but it's also a journey which I don't think could be made again today, and certainly not in the gay, sort of happy-go-lucky cavalier spirit that these chaps did it in.
Fantastic. So you got back, and then you started with the BBC.
Yeah, started with the BBC.
Did they just
radio?
Oh, okay.
In schools. Radio.
Was a job offered to you once you returned, or did you then think?
I think I was in Tehran, in Iran, in Persia, in the English or the British Reading Room, part of the embassy. There was a copy of the Listener magazine.
Okay.
And there was somewhere on the back pages there was an advertisement for a producer of geography programs in the BBC schools department.
Right.
So I thought, well, hell's bells to put in for this.
Yeah, because you had a degree from Cambridge in geography.
But I had to subsequently write about 10 days later saying, forget it, because I won't be back in time for an interview or anything, and I'm not quitting this expedition to...
No.
And they wrote back and said, oh, don't worry, we're not about to make an appointment. Give us a shout when you're back. So I gave them a shout when I'm back. Went for an interview and got the bloody job. Well, undoubtedly, the fact I had just done, a practical piece of geography, drive from London, from the French coast to Singapore, obviously helped a bit. And
sorry, one other question about your journey to Singapore. Where did you start? Where was the starting point from that expedition?
We flew from Lim, which is down in the coast, Dungeness.
Where, sorry?
Dungeness, down in Kent, I think.
Okay, yeah.
Kent or Sussex. Because in those days, you could, if you had the money, fly your car across the channel in a Bristol freighter aircraft. And so we flew. We drove from London to them in Kent, flew across the channel to, I think, I forget whether it was actually I think it was the Touquet rather than Calais. But anyway, I mean, then from there, that's where we count.
This is the starting point.
That's where we start.
Okay.
And we try very hard to find some way around the Bosphorus, somewhere not to go across from east in Istanbul, not to have to take a ferry. But that was the one place in the whole journey where we sort of had to take.
I think that's allowed, permitted.
Right.
So just jumping back to the BBC. So you got your start after you've done this documentary and your expedition to Singapore.
Right.
You then came back and there was almost like a radio job waiting for you because you'd already applied for it.
Well, you see, they weren't putting the film together until we got back.
Yes, editing it together.
Yeah, right.
And how long were you in radio before you then started looking into documentary making?
Not as long as I should have been. About 2.5 years.
Okay. But were you always...
Schools television didn't start until 64.
Okay.
Or 63, I can't remember.
Right. Yeah. And then did you have to learn your trade? Was there a training process that the BBC offered when you...
I think there was a few courses going, but it was really a question of sort of watching other people.
Yeah.
And a lot of the business of making documentaries, I don't know about these days, but in those days, was in the editing. You know, you shot the thing on the basis that this is what, and then subsequently when you got back to base, you edited it.
Yeah.
And that's probably where as much skill in doing a decent edit as doing a decent
job filming
shoot.
It. Yeah, because you create narrative in the edit.
Yes.
And that's a skill in itself.
Part of it was learning as you went along, and so your film would be edited by a professional editor, so that too was a great help. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes, a long time ago.
So at that point, you started with the BBC and you were part of the documentary team. And let's have a look.
Well, I moved on from schools television to grown-up television, if you like.
Okay.
And one of the controllers was Attenborough.
Ah, okay. So you already had that connection with David Attenborough.
Connection a bit. Yes.
Okay, and what was the progression from the BBC Schools TV shows that you were making into adult documentaries with David? How did that happen?
When BBC Schools television started, I'd never been to North America.
Okay.
I did 8 or 9 programs. I think they were only 20-minute programs. They may have been half an hour. Sort of the geography of North America.
Right.
So, we did a program about New York, and some weeks later we were in the middle of the high plains, very empty country. We did that. That's where I became fascinated by the American West.
Okay.
And then some years later, when I had moved on from schools to ordinary television, I put up this idea of doing 5 programs about the West.
Right. So you had that experience from the BBC Schools,
yes.
like educational programs that you'd put together. Were they filmed in the 50s? Those educational.
The ones about America?
The schools.
Schools television didn't really start till I think it was 1963, 64.
Ah, okay. Yeah. So would that? Okay, sure. And then you moved. Then
I moved to normal to general documentary.
And is that when you then pitched the idea to do your documentary for the wet?
Yes, and then put up the idea of doing 5 documentaries about the American West. The original title was "It's More Than Cowboys." Because people would say to me, "Oh, West to cowboys," to which I would say, "Yes, it's cowboys, but there's a hell of a lot else besides cowboys."
Of course.
Yes, and then I wrote a book on it as well. a bit later. I wrote a book after I'd had a row with the boss. And
yeah, was that one of the last things that you did before you left the BBC? Because you handed it in your resignation due to an oversight from what? Well, it seems like an oversight from the boss of BBC One, one of the commissioners.
Yes.
We talked about this briefly when we were driving over here. So, you've done this documentary that about would it be classed as the Midwest in America? The documentary that started BBC Two. Is that the right documentary?
Oh gosh, I don't think it'd be called the Midwest. No, I think it would be the West. The Midwest becomes the West on various people's definitions, but the definition that I use and most people use is, I think it's either the 90th or the 100th meridian.
Okay.
Where you move from fair number of trees out onto the plains, with this really the trees on the watercourses, but otherwise it's wide open spaces. Well, in one state, Wyoming, today is the size of Great Britain, has a population of rather just over 500,000. So, there's not many people.
Yeah.
And that's one of the sort of fascinations of the place.
So, your documentary, the working title was "It's Not Just Cowboys."
It's more than cowboys.
It's more than cowboys. Yeah. Okay. What was that released? What was the title when it came out?
When it came out, what was the title? West is West.
West is West. Okay.
Yes.
Was that the last documentary you made for the BBC before you left? Before you handed in your resignation?
Yes, probably. Because I was going to go off to the... I did go to the Arctic, and I did the reconnaissance, and I did the setting up. When I got back, this rather powerful, dreaded woman, Grace Wyndham Goldie, stepped in and said, no, I was not involved. She said of herself, she wasn't involved, and no, your BBC One appointment.
And West is West was the first documentary aired with BBC Two, is that correct?
I think it was the first travel documentary, yes.
And it was at the launch of the channel?
Because David Attenborough was mostly on BBC One.
Okay.
Yes.
And so BBC Two was launched with your travel documentary about
the West.
About the West in America.
Yes.
And it was very well received and a popular show.
Yes.
And as a result, you went
on the reconnaissance
under the approval
of
people at BBC Two to go to the Arctic and do a documentary about the Arctic. And when you returned,
I got shot down.
Yeah. by one of the commissioning editors at the BBC, BBC One, and at which point you locked horns. And what happened at this point?
Well, I got up and quit. Went in with a letter of resignation, and I had to work out my notice. I think I had to work out 3 months. I can't remember whether it was 3 months or 6 months. And then I went off with my wife and 2 small children to a place called Chadron, Nebraska, and had a wonderful year trying to teach English.
Right, Chadron, Nebraska. That must have been a gear change from a real gear change from the hustle and bustle of London, going out to some... I mean, I don't know it, but I'm presuming it's quite rural.
Oh, very. Yes, it's wide open spaces.
Yeah. And when they
were interested in me, and I was interested in them, so,
Yeah, it must have been a real gear change. Was there no resistance from the BBC to try and keep you after you've given so much good... the documentary was well received, West is West.
There was a certain amount of discussion, but they didn't sort of actually step in. I think a man called Peacock was the controller of BBC Two, and he was the person who'd said, I like what you do, now what do you want to do?
Okay.
And next, and that was when I said I wanted to go to the Arctic, and I went to the Arctic, and when I got back from the Arctic, the row developed. You're not a BBC Two producer, you're a BBC One producer. We let you go to help launch the channel. And the thing fell apart in as much as...
Was it a bureaucracy thing, a power move, or was it because they just wanted you to focus solely on BBC One? It feels, I don't know.
Well, I don't know. I think there was a certain amount of rumbling behind the scenes which didn't actually involve me directly, in as much as this woman, Grace Wyndham Goldie, didn't appreciate Michael Peacock, the controller of BBC Two, having any kind of sway. And so she wanted to establish herself. Yes.
That's a shame.
A certain amount of, well, that happens in most businesses.
Absolutely. There's always...
bit undercurrents that you don't know about at the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. Yes.
That's interesting. So you went to...
So then I went into documentaries and did that one, did other ones, worked on looking at Britain, the helicopter series about this country.
Absolutely. But that was... So how long did you spend in Nebraska whilst you were there for...
I was in Nebraska for a year.
Yep.
And then I
teaching English and
work
journalism.
for a public television station in Syracuse, New York.
Yeah.
For 2 years.
What were you doing at that station?
I was doing documentaries.
Okay.
I can't remember what documentaries I did when I was... I think they were much more local.
Okay.
Much more local. Yes.
And how long were you at PBS for in Syracuse?
2 years.
2 years.
Well, 2 years, but bar a month or two. Yes, and then I came back and I went to work for ITV, because Peacock, the boss of BBC Two, had transferred to ITV.
Right.
So he gave me a job, and that lasted about a year, and then I went back, not on staff in BBC, but on contract.
Okay. 13-part documentary.
And I did 3 of them.
Okay. So 3 of the 13, where was the documentary exclusively shot from a helicopter?
Yes, entirely from a helicopter.
All footage?
All footage. There's nothing shot from the ground at all.
Okay.
And it got to about the 11th or 12th other people were doing, and it was, what shall we do for the 13th? And I sort of stepped forward and said, you start in the Scilly Isles.
Right.
And you finish at the far northern tip of Shetland.
Right.
And that'll cost a bit of money. I said, well, yes, it will, but it make it. So that was one of the most, when I say most marvellous things I've ever done, I don't mean that it reflected on me. I mean, it was interesting beyond measure for me.
Of course.
So start in the Scillies and finish in Shetland.
How many people were on the helicopter?
Usually the pilot, me, and the cameraman.
Right.
And the assistant cameraman and the researcher, or sort of general admin, travel by vehicle.
Okay.
So the team, come the evening, was about 5 people.
Right. That's and when these programs went out on BBC One or Two, and like millions of people would have been watching them because there were only a few channels. The choice wasn't like it is today, where there's thousands.
Right. There wasn't so much competition.
Yeah, it's not as diluted. Back then, there was a lot more focus, and it was a lot more streamlined.
And
how did it?
More money.
Well, there was a lot more money in it. Yeah.
Yes.
How did it feel seeing your programs going out on TV to so many people?
Oh well. Didn't do the ego any harm.
Yeah, of course.
No, and people would occasionally recognise you, rather like you did on the street yesterday. And yes.
Towards the back end of your career at the BBC, you were in more of a commissionary role. You were commissioning documentaries.
Officially, I'm trying to think. AHD, Assistant Head Documentary, AHGD, Assistant Head General Documentaries. In other words, it didn't do art,
right,
and didn't do science, but did general documentaries.
Okay, and was that based at the head?
Eventually, there's a fellow called the head of quit right from when, and a fellow called Will Wyatt, who's just recently retired from the BBC.
Okay.
He's about 12, 13, 14, 15 years younger than I am. He was appointed as the head of the department, and I was his number 2.
And was that based at the television centre?
That was based at television centre.
White City?
Well, it was based partly at television centre and partly it was based nearby called Kensington House.
Okay.
And eventually I realised the fun and interest was not in sending other people off to do the interesting things, but to do them myself. So I quit a little ahead of, I think you had to quit the BBC at 60.
Okay.
I think I quit a few years ahead.
Okay.
In order to go freelance and get back, going to interesting places, instead of sending other people to interesting places.
Of course. That's interesting. And once you had left the BBC in 1990, you wrote a couple of books, I believe. And did you do any further documentaries beyond that? Whilst you?
Well, yes, I did. I can't remember what they were though.
Okay.
I think it was mostly. I think I pretty much quit in 1990 because I was. How old was I in 1990? I was. I was born in 1930, so it was 60.
Right.
So, yes, I turned then to writing because I did write a certain amount for magazines and papers.
Right. And is that when you had 2 books come out? I'm just trying to...
They didn't come out simultaneously.
No. There was the one about the government, and there was a bit of a polemic on the Iraq War.
The most recent one, 20, 25 years old, was attacking, if I can use the word, it was, the Ministry of Defence.
Yeah.
For getting so much, for covering up. They were justified in the war of covering up. But once the war was finished, they were stuck with the cover up because you can't. Then there'd be covering up the cover up.
Yeah, of course. And that book was called Lying in State.
That was called Lying in State. It was originally called, because MOD, Ministry of Defence, it was originally called Ministries of Deception, MOD.
Right.
But for some reason, the publisher didn't like that. What it should have, its title is Lying in State. And this is a thought that only occurred to me some years later. It should have read Lying in State.
Right.
Which is much more convincing than Lying in State, because people didn't quite get the pun in some cases. They thought it was actually some dead body.
Yeah.
Yes.
Who published that book for you?
Well, basically an outfit called Signal, but I get confused because there's several editions.
Okay.
And it's like First Overlands. I think there's 9 or 10 editions of that. If you count German, Portuguese, Spanish, book club, it's sort of...
So your expedition book, First Overland, was first published in...
1957.
And it's still in print today?
Yes. You can go to... what's the big bookshop? Waterstones.
Right.
And ask them, as I did the other day, because I give away quite a lot, you see.
Okay.
And I thought, I've only got 3 copies left, I better get some more. So I went to Waterstones. I could have done it myself, but I'm lazy, and said, get me 10 copies of, which they did.
That's nice.
I had to pay the full price rather than the sort of author's discount because I was so bloody lazy.
Right.
I'd get them to do it.
Yeah.
I find as advancing age you become lazy.
Well, that's all right. And then Lying in State is still available, is it, for people to purchase?
I'm not sure about Lying in State. I've only got 4 copies of that left, and that's a good question. And I was thinking the other day, come on, get your finger out. You need to get more copies. I think Amazon.
You can get it on Amazon.
Is a great repository of these.
So you spent so much time at the BBC in what would be the halcyon period, I would say. Obviously,
Well, looking back on it, yes, compared to today, there was more money. So
More money,
today,
and
I don't want to run down the BBC because they were very good to me over many years. But you look at the BBC and there's not preponderance would be too harsh a word, but think of all the panel shows, So come 6:30 most evenings or many evenings, I say, well, what's on tonight?
Yeah.
So because what is on and when it's on will depend on when I have my supper, or well, bugger it, I'll go out for supper to a restaurant.
Yeah.
So what would I be missing if I do that? And for most of the time between sort of 6 and 10, it's sort of, call it lightweight, no, but it's sort of rather repetitious. And panel shows, each of which is very good in its own right. There's just too many.
I think it's quite remarkable that you went to school with Rupert Murdoch. That's crazy.
I don't think he'd think it was remarkable.
No,
I keep trying to think of a good excuse to write to him. Dear Rupert, he was known as Boop.
Boop.
B-O-O-P. Boop Murdoch.
Why was he called Boop?
I don't have no idea. Just as a nickname.
That's okay. That's really interesting. And then obviously you had a strong working relationship with David Attenborough, and
I don't know about a strong working. We knew it. He knew who I was, and I've been to his place for supper, and we've been to restaurants. He lives, as you said earlier, in Richmond.
Yeah.
And I live in
Southfields in Wimbledon. That's right.
When I had the car, it was sort of a 10-minute drive. Yes.
That's remarkable. And I'm guessing the modern TV format you feel is a little bit kind of repetitious and dumbed down, and there's not as much money in it. And
well, I feel rather sympathy with the directors and producers because they don't have the money. And I think I was lucky. I could go to the boss and say, I've just realised that next year Australia will be 200 years old. Surely the BBC ought to be recognising that in some kind of a series, documentary series about Australian history. And he would say, good point.
Off you go.
Off you go.
How would it be structured? Would they just give you a budget? And how many people were behind the decision to validate it, to approve it? Sorry, not validate.
No, I was lucky. It was there at the right time.
Yeah.
I think it'd be much more difficult today.
Yeah.
Well, I know it is more difficult today, and there isn't the money. You couldn't go to the boss, whoever he might be today, and say, Australia's 200 years old.
Let's go.
Or I want to do a series about the American West. Or let's get a helicopter and do a series. Well, that's a bit unfair because that was rather more at the corporate level.
Right. Out of everything you've worked on, what do you think is the crown jewel of your career? Like, if there's something that you're most proud of, because you've done some exceptional things.
I think the American West I'm quite proud of.
Yeah.
But I would have to emphasise quite. I'm not, my daughter I once said to my daughter something I was proud of, and she said, "No, you're not proud of. You're bloody conceited."
Nah.
And I congratulated her on being sort of sufficiently
direct.
Direct, yes.
Yeah.
And I felt I had something to do with that, given that I was her father.
Oh, well, there you go.
Even so I said, I'm quite proud that you make that kind of direct comment.
Absolutely. Well, Tim Slessor, it's been an absolute privilege talking to you. We'll wrap it up and.
Well, thank you very much.
No,
I haven't performed terribly well, but
no, you've been great.
Well, thank you for your questions, which allowed me to burble on.
No, it's been great. Thank you.
Thank you.